The ground here is perfect.
Talia tapped a final command into her datapad, her slender, silver-gray fingers gliding over the holographic interface. The device chirped, projecting a transparent, geological cross-section of the forest floor into the air between them. Layers of topsoil, clay, and bedrock appeared, overlaid with analytical data.
My analysis indicates the soil composition is primarily loam with a high humic acid content. Excellent porosity. It will absorb any significant precipitation with ease. We are, statistically speaking, in the safest possible location.
Good,
said Koro, pinching the fleshy bridge of his face where his 20 hypersensitive nostrils converged in an intricate, fleshy whirl. He took a shallow, testing breath.
Because the atmospheric spore count is already triggering my allergenic response pathways. I could smell dampness, chlorophyll, at least 11 distinct varieties of pollen, and yes, definitely the unmistakable olfactory signature of decomposing rodentia. It's a lot. That's called nature, Koro,
Farah drawled, now looking up from the piece of flint she was meticulously sharpening against a larger rock. She had found it by the creek and declared it her crude shiv. She wore black, fingerless gloves, and the subdermal plating along her forearms rippled with faint, restless micro-vibrations, like a cat purring under the skin.
It's the raw, unfiltered truth of a wild world. We came here to escape the sterile perfection of the compound, did we not? To feel something real? Let the flames of rebellion cleanse our sanitized existence.
10, the quiet Aquarian of the group, said nothing. He simply stood at the entrance of their high-tech self-assembling tent, a marvel of lightweight alloys and smart fabrics. The darkening clouds, a bruised palette of purple and angry gray, gathered overhead with a speed that felt personal. The small gills on his neck, colored like a thunderhead with streaks of silver, usually lying flat and nearly invisible, flared slightly, catching the dimming light as he tasted the rising humidity in the air. He had read about Terran thunderstorms in 1,000 atmospheric simulations, but to witness one, that was different.
It's not rebellion, Vera. It's a controlled educational excursion into a designated wilderness zone,
Talia corrected, her tone crisp and condescending. She swiped the hologram away with a flick of her wrist.
The free forest is a legend the administrators tacitly permit to function as a pressure release valve for students exactly like you. Their risk assessment, which is based on 74 Terran years of stable, archived climate data, gives this sector a 99.8% probability of clement weather. A little drizzle at most, nothing our equipment can't handle.
As if summoned by her hubris, the first fat drop of rain landed squarely on the smooth, dark screen of her datapad. The drop landed, not with a splash, but with a sizzle. A sharp puff of ozone, a frantic flicker of blue sparks from the charging port, and the device went dark. The complex symphony of galactic microprocessing inside it died in an instant, shorted into silence by a single drop of shockingly conductive Terran water. Talia stared at it, her mouth falling open. She shook it, a gesture of helpless frustration that was beneath her. Nothing. It was a dead, useless slab of metal and glass. Then the sky tore open. The drizzle intensified, becoming a vertical river. Rain fell in solid, wind-whipped sheets, a liquid wall so dense it blurred the mighty trees into a green and brown smear. The sound was a deafening, percussive roar, a constant, overwhelming assault on the thin membrane of their tent that vibrated through the soles of their boots.
The auto-sealing seams are failing,
Talia shouted, her voice thin against the gale. She pointed a trembling finger at a corner where a steady, pressurized jet of water was now shooting inward, pooling on the floor. The tent's internal atmosphere scrubber, designed to filter out pollen and microbes, gurgled, coughed out a plume of steam, and died with a final, pathetic wheeze.
I told you!
Koro shrieked, scrambling onto his sleep mats as if it were a life raft in a churning sea of mud. The water was already ankle-deep.
This isn't just water. My external sensors were right. It's a suspension of unknown microorganisms, a viral slurry. The air is a thick soup of pollen, fungal spores, and petrichor. It's overwhelming!
Shut up and help me, Vera yelled, abandoning her crude chiv to stuff a thermal blanket into the leaking seam. The advanced self-warming fabric immediately soaked through, becoming a heavy, dripping weight that did nothing. She fumbled at her belt for her personal beamer, a sleek Sindarian device designed to project a contained cone of intense heat. It fizzled violently in her hand, the emitter glowing a sickly green for a moment before extinguishing with an audible pop.
Scrap!
She roared in frustration.
It's useless. Same as the plasma lighter and the sonic shovel. This water is poison to our tech.
Her cry of despair confirmed their predicament. Their sonic shovel, which could excavate a trench in seconds by vibrating soil particles apart, was dead. Their plasma lighter, which could ignite even damp wood, was dead. All their sophisticated energy-based tools were inert, fancy paperweights in the face of this raw, relentless water. Talia's absorbent loam was a lie. Her perfect data had failed her. The ground, already saturated, could take no more. It had become a supersaturated sponge, and the water, with nowhere else to go, was rising. Their polished, state-of-the-art campsite, a marvel of galactic engineering, had been defeated in under 5 minutes by common mud. Shivering, Ten remained by the entrance, his face tilted into the spray. He saw the storm now as raw, untamed power. He watched the lightning, great, jagged scars of superheated plasma tearing across the indigo clouds, and felt a sliver of profound fear finally mixing with his awe. It was in the brief, blinding flash of one of these bolts that they saw him, a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line. He wasn't struggling, or running for cover, or panicking. He was just there. He was tall and lean, clad in dark, worn-looking gear that shed water as if it were an extension of his own skin. A simple, dark green tarp was slopped over his head and angled away from the wind, a makeshift roof held up by a branch and a rope, and it seemed more effective than their entire smart tent. In one hand, he held a steaming ceramic mug. He took a slow, deliberate sip, his eyes tracking their frantic, useless flailing inside the collapsing tent. He seemed less like a person and more like a natural part of the forest, as permanent and unbothered as the ancient oaks around him. For a full minute, he just watched, a silent observer to their slow-motion disaster. After another long, silent moment of observation, he lowered his mug and spoke. His voice was calm and plain, yet it carried with an unnerving clarity, cutting through the roar of the storm.
Y'all are gonna flood your tent if you don't trench it.
He took another sip from his mug, his gaze unwavering.
You ever dig a runoff line?
They stared, a quartet of dripping, shivering, technologically advanced idiots. Talia's mind, a finely tuned instrument for data processing and procedures, raced through 1,000 subroutines for first contact with unvetted local populations. All of them assumed a position of overwhelming technological superiority. None of them involved being ankle-deep in mud, while the local in question looked on them with an expression of mild, pitying curiosity. The human sighed, a small puff of steam in the cold air. He seemed to weigh his options, his gaze shifting from their pathetic state to the rising water. With a subtle shrug that seemed to convey a deep sense of weary obligation, he set his mug down on a flat, mossy rock, where it sat perfectly level. From a pack on his hip, he produced a folding metal tool, which he snapped open with a single, deft flick of his wrist. An entrenching tool, Talia's memory supplied from a deep-dive historical database on pre-industrial human warfare. A basic shovel. He crouched, his eyes low to the ground, ignoring them completely. He seemed to be in a conversation with the land itself. He watched the way the water was behaving, the way the tiny rivulets were already forming, seeking the path of least resistance around a thick, gnarled tree root and a submerged stone. He tilted his head, as if listening to the ground,
reading a complex language of flow and gravity that they couldn't comprehend. Talia found herself mentally calculating flow rates and soil permeability. But her equations were abstract and useless. This human was dealing in reality. Then, his movements economical and brutal, he began to dig. He didn't fight the water, he guided it. He carved a shallow, curving channel, not where he thought it should go, but where the water already wanted to go. It was a subtle, brilliant act of cooperation with physics. The gathering puddle that had been creeping toward their tent, the leading edge of their doom, found the new trench, hesitated for a second as if considering its options, and then poured into it, flowing away in a neat, orderly stream that vanished into the undergrowth downhill. It was simple. It was elegant. It was infuriatingly, devastatingly effective. He finished his work in less than 2 minutes. He scraped the mud from the tool, folded it with another clean snap, and clipped it back to his belt. He picked up his mug and looked at them, his expression unreadable in the stormy gloom. For a long, heart-stopping moment, Talia thought he might just turn and walk away, leaving them to their fate. His part was done. He had demonstrated the solution. The rest was up to them. But their tent floor was now a cold, sloshing puddle. Their gear was soaked. Coro was hyperventilating, his expensive environmental suit offering no comfort against the rising tide of his own terror. Vera's fiery bravado had been extinguished as thoroughly as her beamer. They had no tools. They had no knowledge. They had nothing but flawed data and broken, waterlogged pride. Defeat was a bitter, unfamiliar taste in Talia's mouth, like acid. She tried to think of a solution. One last attempt to salvage their autonomy.
Vera, find a flat rock. Coro, your sleep mat. Try to build a dam.
But her commands were hollow, pointless against the steady ingress of water. The mud flowed around their pathetic efforts. She finally accepted the truth. She pushed through the torn tent flap, the cold rain hitting her face, the shock of it stealing the air from her lungs, a baptism into failure. She stood before the human, water dripping from the tip of her nose, her meticulously styled cranial ridges now plastered to her scope like wet noodles.
Excuse me?
She said, her voice tight with the monumental effort of swallowing her academic arrogance. It came out as a pathetic squeak. She cleared her throat, the sound swallowed by the storm, and tried again, forcing the words out from a place of deep, humbling desperation.
Could you show us?
The human, then, he'd introduced himself in a laconic Appalachian drawl that twisted their universal translators with its regional eccentricities, didn't offer platitudes or mock their incompetence. He just gave a single, sharp nod, and unclipped 2 more shovels from a larger, sodden pack he'd left leaning against a tree. They were heavy, brutish things, with worn wooden handles and blades of beaten-up steel, caked with the memory of old dirt. He handed one to Talia, and the other to Vera.
Follow the low spots,
he said, pointing with his chin toward the swirling water.
Water always wins. Don't try to make it go uphill.
It was the most profound and simultaneously the most obvious thing Talia had ever heard. Her mind, which held doctorates in xenogeology and theoretical planetary science, felt like a child's toy. The work was brutal. The shovels were heavy and awkward, designed for a species with a different musculature and center of gravity. The mud was a thick, greedy slime that slicked their boots and tried to suck them off their feet. Within a minute, Talia's arms ached with a deep, unfamiliar burn. Her pristine uniform, a marvel of thermal-regulating nanofibers, was smeared with grime. She felt a primal revulsion, a deep-seated criterion aversion to direct, unfiltered contact with planetary soil. She knew the specific mineral percentages of this loam, its cation exchange capacity, its exact pH. None of that data conveyed the shocking, abrasive weight of the wooden handle in her hands, the cold suction of the mud against the shovel's blade, or the sight of her own meticulously clean fingers caked in something so unstructured, so real.
I'm inhaling it!
Coro wailed from the relative safety of a large, mossy rock he had claimed as his island.
The mud! It's aerosolized! I can smell anaerobic bacteria, nematodes, trace amounts of granite, and a fungal spore I can't identify. My lungs are becoming a terrarium!
Vin paused his own work. His digging was a fluid, rhythmic motion, twice as fast and 10 times as neat as theirs. He walked over to Coro, his movements unhurried despite the deluge, a bubble of calm in the storm. He reached into a pocket of his worn trousers and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden case with tiny ventilation holes. He slid the lid open. On his finger crawled a tiny creature, no bigger than his thumbnail. It was starkly black with intricate white markings on its back, and it moved with a jerky, intelligent curiosity. A jumping spider. 8 legs, a cluster of enormous forward-facing black eyes, and 2 fangs that flashed with hints of green and purple. "This is Steve," Vin said, his voice completely level. He held his finger out. Coro's mind, a frantic engine of threat assessment, tried to categorize the creature. Class, Arachnida. Order, Arenae. Likely family, Salticidae. The clinical data was a shield, but it was thin. The spider pivoted its whole carapace to look directly at him, and its cluster of black eyes seemed to stare right through the flimsy barrier of his intellect, into the screaming heart of his panic. "He lives in the dirt," Vin said simply. "Breathes the air. He's fine. You're fine." Coro stared, his 20 nostrils quivering in unison. The spider was a living embodiment of his deepest fears, an 8-legged, multi-eyed, venomous native organism. Yet, it wasn't menacing. It was just there, calm. Its tiny alien presence was so mundane, so utterly unbothered by the storm or Coro's existential terror, that it somehow short-circuited his runaway anxiety. Vin then plucked a large, waxy leaf from a nearby rhododendron bush, wiped it clean on his trousers, and handed it to Coro. "Breathe through this if you have to. It's just dirt." Coro took the leaf. His fingers trembled. He held it over his face, inhaling shakily. It smelled green and clean, a filter against the terrifying complexity of the mud. He watched Vin go back to digging. The tiny spider, Steve, now perched calmly on the collar of his jacket like a miniature living gargoyle. Slowly, Coro lowered the leaf. He took a breath. It was still a soup of overwhelming smells, but the sharpest edge of his fear had been blunted by the absurd, undeniable courage of a very small spider. Their tent was a write-off. The frame had buckled under a particularly strong gust of wind, and the interior was now a small, muddy lake. The wreckage a monument to their failure. Then, with an air of grim practicality, directed them to salvage what they could. They waded into the mess, retrieving their sodden sleep mats and a few waterproof food packs. Their other gear was either ruined or already swept away. "Gotta get out of the wind," he stated, not asked. He led them deeper into the woods, to a place where a low, rocky overhang formed a shallow cave, a dark mouth in the hillside. Using the large tarp from his own pack and the tattered, still useful remains of their smart tent, he began to construct a shelter. He worked with the environment. He used 2 young, supple trees as anchor points, a fallen log as a windbreak, and the rock face as a solid back wall. He showed them how to tie knots that tightened under pressure, knots that were simple, ancient, and perfect. The aliens, used to technology that anticipated their needs, were clumsy and slow, but they followed his quiet directions. They were no longer students on an excursion. They were apprentices in the art of staying alive. He rigged a surprisingly sturdy lean-to against the rock face, angling it perfectly against the driving rain. It was cramped, a tight squeeze for 5 bodies, but it was dry. Then he built a fire. Not with a plasma lighter or chemical accelerant, but with a sliver of paper-thin birch bark, a handful of dry twigs he produced from a waterproof pouch at his hip, and a small ferrocerium rod that he scraped with the back of his knife. The shower of hot sparks caught, the tinder smoldered, and in moments, a small, bright fire was crackling merrily in a carefully constructed stone pit that reflected heat back into their shelter. The effect was immediate and profound. The frantic, high-strung energy of the last hour bled away, replaced by a fragile, huddled camaraderie. The dominant sounds were no longer the roar of the storm and their own panicked shouts, but the steady, hypnotic drumming of rain on the tarp and the cheerful crackle of the flames. The air inside their small space grew warm, smelling of wood smoke, damp wool, and a strange, new scent. Safety. Talia found herself sitting shoulder to shoulder with Vera, their earlier friction forgotten in the face of a shared elemental threat. Koro, wrapped in 2 thermal blankets, was staring into the flames, his anxiety soothed by the heat and the simple, repetitive dance of the light. Ten sat closest to the opening, his gills barely fluttering, watching the rain with a new, more respectful kind of awe. They were a strange collection of beings, the children of galactic elites, crammed together under a sheet of plastic in a foreign corner of a backwater world. But for the first time since they trespassed into the free forest, they felt something real.
Y'all hungry?
Vin asked, rummaging in his pack. Before they could answer, he produced 3 items that their universal translators identified with varying degrees of confusion. A bag of puffy white cylinders labeled marshmallows, several thin brown slabs in a wrapper that read Graham crackers, and a bar of dark, segmented material called chocolate. S'mores, he said, as if that single word explained the entire universe. He demonstrated with the patience of a master teaching his craft. He sharpened the end of a green stick with his knife, skewered a marshmallow, and held it over the fire. It browned, then caught fire in a glorious little blaze. He blew it out with a puff of air, revealing a perfectly toasted molten golden exterior and a gooey liquid interior. Then he expertly sandwiched this between 2 crackers with a piece of chocolate. The residual heat from the marshmallow melted the chocolate, creating a warm, messy, incredible-smelling concoction. He handed the first one to Koro. Koro held it delicately, like a bomb or a priceless artifact. He brought it toward his face, his nostrils flaring, analyzing.
Hydrolyzed sucrose, theobromine compounds from the cocoa bean, emulsifiers, complex carbohydrates from the triticum estivum cracker.
He took a tiny, hesitant bite. His eyes widened. The complex sensory input overrode his analytical brain.
It's shocking,
he declared, his mouth full of goo.
But not unpleasant olfactory assault.
He devoured the rest in 3 seconds and immediately held his stick out for another, the earlier fears of unknown Terran foodstuffs completely forgotten. It was a culinary revelation. Vera, who normally subsisted on high-protein nutrient paste and Sindarian fire peppers, ate 3. Her subdermal plating grew warm to the touch, the micro-vibrations settling into a steady, pleasant hum. Talia, the meticulous geologist, found a strange satisfaction in the imprecise, messy process, getting chocolate on her fingers and not even caring. Even Ten managed a small, quiet smile as the melted chocolate dripped onto his hand, a warm, sweet sensation, so unlike the cold water he was used to. It was a simple act, sharing food, but it felt like a treaty, a communion. After they had exhausted the marshmallows, Vin nonchalantly poked at a rotting log near the fire pit with his knife. He pried up a piece of bark, revealing the teeming life within. He plucked out a fat, pale white grub, thick as his thumb. More protein. He shrugged, skewering it on his stick and holding it over the flames. It sizzled, browned, and smelled surprisingly nutty, like roasted seeds. He popped it into his mouth and chewed thoughtfully.
Not bad. Kind of like a peanut.
He offered the stick to Vera. She looked from the wiggling grubs still in the log to Vin's dead serious face, and back to the empty stick. The warmth from her subdermal plating, which had hummed with pleasure at the s'mores, faded, and the vibrations became erratic and faint. For the first time, her rebellious bravado met a challenge it couldn't posture its way through.
I'll stick with the pyrolyzed sucrose, thanks,
she said, her voice a little shaky. The aliens looked at Vin, not as a simple native, but as a culinary pragmatist of terrifying proportions. He just shrugged again, a gesture they were coming to understand as the universal sign for, this is normal. You're the weird ones. As the night deepened and the s'mores were reduced to sticky fingers and a few stray crumbs, a comfortable quiet settled over the group. The shared warmth and full bellies had loosened their tongues, and the ancient human tradition of storytelling around a fire took hold.
On Cinderia,
Vera began, her voice low and dramatic, leaning into the firelight.
we tell tales of the ash wraiths. They are beings of pure heat and memory that haunt the great geothermal vents of the volcanic plains. They say if one touches you, it doesn't burn your skin. It burns away your purpose, your ambition, leaving you an empty, hollow shell, doomed to wander the wastes forever.
Koro shivered, pulling his blanket tighter.
The scariest things on Glibor are the psychic parasites. They're microscopic, airborne. They don't attack your body, they infect your anxieties. They find what you fear most and whisper it into your mind, amplifying it until you can't tell their voice from your own. My third cousin once became so convinced his own nostrils were plotting against him that he sealed them with cosmetic sealant. It was a very trying family reunion.
They all looked at Talia. She hesitated, straightening her back.
Criterion horror is more abstract, more terrifying. We fear data corruption. The idea that the foundational knowledge upon which our entire civilization is built could have a single, cascading flaw in it, a miscalculated variable from centuries ago that would bring the whole system crashing down. We call it the silent error. It is the ghost in our machine.
10, ever the observer, spoke softly, his voice barely louder than the rain.
On Aquaria, we have no ghosts. The deep currents wash everything away, even memories. But we fear the stillness, the deep, lightless abyssal trenches where the water doesn't move, where pressure is absolute. To be trapped there, alone in the silent, crushing dark, forever. That is our fear.
The fire crackled, the flames casting dancing, distorted shadows on the rock wall behind them. They all turned to their host. Vin was poking the embers with a stick, his face a mask of shadow and orange light.
What about you, Ben?
Vera asked, her voice softer now.
What are human ghost stories like?
Vin stared into the fire for a long moment, as if pulling the story from the embers themselves.
When I was a kid,
He started, his voice a low rumble.
my granddad told me about this one spot deep in the woods, maybe 5 miles south of here. Said there was an old raccoon that got sick with something fierce. Rabies, maybe. Kind of sickness that gets in the brain. It just walked in circles for 3 days until it died. Never ate, never drank. Just walked in a perfect circle under a big hemlock tree.
He paused, letting the simple, stark image hang in the air.
Years later, my granddad was out trapping and found its skull. It was all green with moss, half buried in the duff, sitting right in the middle of that circle. which was still there, a faint ring worn into the dirt. He brought the skull home, cleaned it up with borax, and set it on his mantelpiece.
He looked up from the fire, his eyes meeting theirs in the flickering light.
That night, he woke up to a scratching sound at his cabin door. He looked out the peephole, and there was nothing there. But the next morning, when he went outside, there was a circle scratched into the wood of his porch. The night after that, he heard it again, and in the morning, the circle was on his front door. The next, it was on the wall of his bedroom, right above his head. He said he finally got so spooked he took that skull, walked it 10 miles back to that spot in the woods, and buried it deep. Said the scratching stopped after that.
He poked the fire again, sending a shower of sparks into the dark.
I dug that skull up later. It sits right over my bed in my shack.
A profound, bone-deep silence fell over the shelter, broken only by the rain and the fire. Their stories had been of cosmic horrors, psychic parasites, and existential dread. His was about a sick raccoon, a dirty bone, and a sound at the door. And somehow, its grounded, grubby reality was far more terrifying than any of them. It sent a deeper chill through them than any plasma wraith ever could. It was Ten who noticed it first. His whole life had been spent immersed in fluid dynamics, in the rhythms of tides and currents. He was attuned to the movement of water, whether it was in a planetary ocean or a puddle. The rain's rhythm was changing. The frantic, hammering roar was steadying into a deeper, heavier beat. But underneath it, a new sound was emerging. This was a continuous, deep, grinding roar. A vibration he could feel not just in his ears, but in the rock beneath him. A low-frequency hum that resonated deep in his chest. It was a single, long, guttural breath. Koro smelled it next. His nostrils, which had been trying to relax, twitched violently. He sat bolt upright, his face pale in the firelight.
What was that?
He whispered, his voice trembling.
The odor profile of the air just shifted drastically. It's wet stone and decaying organics on a massive scale, and mud. So much mud, it smells like the whole forest floor is moving.
He imagined some great subterranean beast, a slumbering behemoth awakened by the storm, stirring in the deep earth beneath them. Talia, ever the scientist, was already trying to analyze it, her eyes closed, her head tilted.
It's a low-frequency rumble, infrasound. It's not atmospheric in origin, it's terrestrial.
She tried to fit it into her broken models.
A localized seismic event, perhaps. A subterranean landslide triggered by the extreme water saturation. The loam layer could be sloughing off the bedrock.
They all looked to Vin. He had gone completely, unnaturally still. The stick he'd been using to poke the fire lay forgotten by his side. His head was cocked, his body rigid, his attention focused entirely on the world outside their tiny haven. All the laconic, easy calm was gone, stripped away to reveal something coiled and feral underneath. He felt the vibration, not in the rock, but in his gut. A deep, primal warning passed down through generations of people who had lived and died by the moods of this land. Vera, unnerved by his sudden, absolute stillness, finally broke the silence.
Vin, what is it? Is that more thunder?
Vin slowly turned his head, his eyes dark and serious in the firelight. His voice, when he spoke, was flat and devoid of any accent. It was the voice of absolute, terrifying certainty.
That ain't thunder.
He stood up in a single fluid motion and kicked a pile of dirt onto the fire, dampening the cheerful flames to a dull, smoking glow.
The river's coming up. Fast.
Reality came for them. A 3-foot-high wall of churning brown water that burst through the trees at the edge of their small clearing. This was a liquid battering ram, carrying a payload of rocks, branches, and soil. The water hit their carefully built fire pit with a deafening, explosive hiss, plunging them into near total darkness. The only light now was the infrequent, brilliant, and terrifying flash of lightning. The surge of water, shockingly cold and powerful, slammed into their lean-to, tearing the tarp from its moorings. It swirled around their ankles, then their knees, pulling at them with a shocking, muscular force. For 10, it was a terrifying perversion of his element. Water was supposed to be a pressure, a support, a medium of life. This was a concussive force full of sharp edges, grit and sticks and stolen earth, that tore instead of flowed. Panic, cold and absolute, erupted anew. Koro let out a high-pitched, terrified scream that was swallowed by the roar. Vera scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rock face, her subdermal plating thrumming erratically against the rock face, a panicked rhythm in the dark. Talia's mind went blank, all her scientific knowledge, all her carefully constructed models erased by the primal reptilian fear of drowning in the dark. Vin didn't shout. He didn't scream. He acted. His hand shot out in the darkness, grabbed the collar of Talia's tunic, yanking her back from the edge of the current just as her feet slipped. His voice cut through their collective fear, not with volume, but with a calm, steel-edged urgency that demanded obedience.
High ground! Now! That way!
In the next flash of lightning, they saw him pointing, not randomly, but at a specific steep section of the rocky outcrop that formed the back of their shelter. It looked forebodingly steep, a sheer wall slick with rain. But Talia's mind, jolted from its panic by Vin's command, kicked back in. Her geologist's eye, now trusting raw observation over her failed data, saw what he saw. Not a sheer cliff, but a series of stable ledges and handholds. Gneiss and granite, not crumbling schist. It was climbable.
He's right,
she yelled, her voice finding its authority again.
The rock is solid. Look for the quartz veins. They'll give you grip.
Vera, her performative bravado boiling away to reveal a core of genuine, protective courage, didn't hesitate. She grabbed the whimpering Koro by the arm, her grip like a vice, hauling him toward the rock face.
Move, Koro! Move or you're fish food!
Another bolt of lightning seared the sky white, illuminating the scene in stark, horrifying detail. 10, seeing his chance, didn't flinch from the light. He used the prolonged strobing illumination, his eyes tracking the path up the rock.
There!
He shouted, pointing.
A handhold, 3 feet up, to the left of the fern.
Their individual strengths, once sources of friction and arrogance, were now their only hope, and Vin was the catalyst that fused them together. The scramble was a frantic, vertical nightmare. The rock was slick with rain and algae. The floodwaters roared below them, rising with terrifying speed, tugging at their legs, trying to suck them down into the churning, debris-filled chaos. Vin led the way, moving with a mountain goat's certainty, his worn boots finding purchase in invisible cracks and on slick, mossy surfaces. He'd shout down instructions, simple and direct words that were life itself.
Left foot here. Use the root. Don't look down. Watch your hands.
Talia went next, translating his raw instructions into technical advice for the others while she climbed.
That's pegmatite dike. It's solid. Trust it. Avoid the shale deposit to your right.
She moved with desperation, each handhold and foothold tested and secured before she shifted her weight. For a fleeting moment, as her hand found a solid hold Vin had pointed out, a thought flashed through her mind. Logic, strength, observation, guidance. We're working. Vera, her strength raw and real, practically shoved Koro up the rock face from below, her subdermal lights providing a small, pulsing beacon in the dark between lightning flashes.
Climb, damn you!
She yelled, her voice raw.
Think of it as escaping a bad smell. A really, really bad smell.
The desperate, absurd encouragement cut through his terror just enough for him to move his limbs. 10, at the rear, acted as their spotter, using the strobing effect of the lightning to map the path ahead and call out hazards or helping holds they couldn't see from their angles.
Watch out for that loose rock, Talia. Vera, there's a better foothold just above Koro's head.
They climbed, hand over aching hand, foot over slipping foot, their movements clumsy and terrified, but unified. Vin hauled himself over a final ledge and immediately dropped to his belly, reaching back down, his hand clamping around Talia's wrist with unyielding strength. He pulled her up, and together they reached down for Vera, who in turn helped drag a sobbing, shivering Koro onto the relative safety of a wide, flat shelf of rock about 15 feet above the maelstrom. Ten clambered up last, collapsing onto the ledge, his gills flaring and contracting rapidly as he gasped the wet, clean air. They huddled together, a heap of exhausted bodies, and looked down. In the next flash of lightning, they saw their entire campsite, the remnants of the tent, their packs, the river pit, Vin's salvaged tarp, lifted by the brown water and swept away, vanishing into the roaring darkness. Everything that connected them to the compound, to their technology, to their old lives, was gone. They were soaked, freezing, and utterly, completely lost. But they were alive, and they were together. Dawn arrived, not with a bang, but with a whisper. The roar of the flood began to subside as the water level crested and then slowly receded, leaving behind a thick blanket of mud and debris. The rain softened to a gentle drizzle, then stopped altogether. A pale gray light filtered through the canopy, followed by the first tentative rays of a watery sun. The world was washed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, the cacophony of the storm replaced by the gentle dripping of water from a billion leaves and the distant, chastened gurgle of the retreating river. They were sprawled on the sun-warmed rock, a tangle of exhausted limbs and muddy, torn uniforms. The shared trauma and the quiet, profound beauty of the morning had forged a powerful, unspoken bond between them. The barriers of species, status, and personality had been eroded away by the flood as surely as the riverbank below.
My models, they didn't account for the topography upstream,
Talia said, her voice quiet and hoarse. She was staring at her mud-caked hands as if seeing them for the first time.
All the atmospheric data, it's all meaningless. All the data in the galaxy doesn't matter if you don't know which way the creek bends. I've never been so terrified in my entire life,
Koro admitted, his voice surprisingly steady. He was sitting up watching a beetle navigate a puddle.
But when Vera was yelling at me to climb, for a second, I forgot to be scared of the microbes. I was just scared of falling. It was a nice change of pace.
Vera managed a weak, genuine smile.
The flames of rebellion are a lot wetter and muddier than I imagined.
She looked at the others, her usual bravado gone, replaced by a raw, quiet sincerity.
I'm sorry. I pushed you all into this. This was my stupid, arrogant idea. I'm not sorry,
Tin said softly, his eyes on the sunlight breaking through the clouds, turning the hanging water droplets on a spider's web into a million tiny prisms, each catching and fracturing the light.
I wanted to see a storm, and I did.
They lay in a comfortable silence for a while, equals on a rock in the middle of a forest that had almost killed them. The full realization of their situation began to settle in. They were stranded, with no gear, no communication, and no idea how far they were from the compound. The administration's honeypot had become a genuine trap, sprung by their own hubris. Wordlessly, Vera sat up. She reached into a small, sealed pocket on the inside of her jacket, a place she'd hoped no one would ever see. She pulled out a single, sleek cylinder, about the size of her thumb, a Sindarian emergency flare, a concession to safety her powerful father had forced on her, a device she had resented, calling it a leash, the ultimate symbol of weakness. Now, it was their only hope. It was an admission of complete and utter defeat, but it was also an act of profound responsibility. She had started this. She had to end it. Her hand trembled as she held it. Part of her, the old Vera, wanted to throw it into the river, to prove they could survive on their own. But she looked at Coral's pale face, at Talia's exhausted resignation, and knew that kind of pride was a luxury they no longer had. She looked at Talia, who met her gaze and gave a single, slow nod of understanding. She looked at Vin, who just watched her with his unreadable, quiet expression, offering neither judgment nor encouragement. The choice was hers. With a deep breath that shuddered through her whole body, Vera twisted the base. The device shot from her hand with a piercing, high-frequency shriek. High above the canopy, it exploded, not with a crude Terran chemical fire, but with a silent, brilliant plume of contained plasma, a miniature incandescent sun that burned with the pure white fire of her home star. It was a beacon of failure and of hope. The rescue shuttle, a sleek silver teardrop, descended less than an hour later. The medics, clad in sterile white environmental suits, swarmed out, clucking over their muddy appearance and running frantic bioscans with humming devices. The contrast between the medics' sterile panic and the raw, earthy reality of the last 12 hours was jarring.
The flare sliced through the rescue team's frantic wide-beam search, giving them an instant pinpoint lock on your passive trackers, the lead medic explained as she guided a shivering Koro toward the ramp. Without it, searching this sensor shadow could have taken days. You're very lucky. The goodbye was awkward. The speed and order of the rescue felt like an intrusion, a return to a world they no longer quite fit into. Our family will compensate you for your services, Talia said formally to Vin, sounding like her old self, though the arrogance in her voice was gone, replaced by a quiet respect. Generously.
My father, the sub-praetor of Glibor, will grant you an olfactory boon,
Koro offered earnestly, pausing at the shuttle door.
A lifetime supply of premium nasal filters, the best in the galaxy.
Vera just looked at Vin, her subdermal plating humming with a soft, steady warmth.
Stay dangerous,
she said, and for the first time, it sounded less like a slogan and more like a piece of genuine, hard-won advice. 10 simply bowed his head, his gills flaring in a gesture of deep, silent respect. Vin accepted none of it. He just stood there in his damp, worn clothes, his hands in his pockets, a permanent fixture of the woods.
Don't need anything,
he said. He looked at them, a strange, mismatched collection of colorful, noisy creatures who had briefly blundered into his world and survived.
Just listen to the water next time.
He watched their shuttle ascend, its anti-grav engines whining, until it was just a glint in the morning sky. The forest fell silent again. His forest. The only sounds were the birds, the dripping leaves, and the murmur of the now docile river. The world was as it had been. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out the small wooden case. He slid the lid open, and Steve, the spider, crawled confidently onto his finger, then held the tiny creature up, its legs tickling his skin, its cluster of eyes gleaming in the sun.
Well,
Vin said to the spider, his Appalachian drawl returning in the quiet of the woods.
that was weird.